Born Madison Marie on April 3, 1985, Madison's childhood was steeped in the idyllic charm of small-town America. Her parents raised her with a blend of love, discipline, and an appreciation for the arts. From an early age, Madison displayed a voracious appetite for literature. Her parents nurtured this passion, filling their modest home with books and encouraging Madison's academic pursuits. As she blossomed into a teenager, Madison's intelligence and beauty made her a popular figure at Pine Haven High School, though she often preferred the company of books to that of her peers. It was during her senior year that Madison met Caspian Alwyn, a charismatic transfer student with dreams of becoming a journalist. Caspian's quick wit and shared love of literature quickly captured Madison's heart. Their whirlwind romance became the talk of the town, with many predicting a bright future for the young couple. After graduating high school, Madison and Caspian both attended the University of Oregon. Madison pursued a degree in library science, while Caspian studied journalism. Their college years were marked by late-night study sessions, passionate debates about literature, and dreams of a life filled with adventure and intellectual pursuits. Upon graduation, the couple returned to Pine Haven. Madison secured a position at the local library, quickly working her way up to head librarian. Caspian, however, struggled to find fulfilling work in the small town. His dreams of becoming an investigative journalist seemed increasingly out of reach in the quiet confines of Pine Haven. On a crisp autumn day, Madison and Caspian exchanged vows in a picturesque ceremony at the Pine Haven Community Church. The entire town turned out to celebrate the union of two of its brightest young stars. For a time, it seemed that Madison had achieved the perfect life, a fulfilling career, a loving husband, and the respect of her community. But as the years passed, cracks began to appear in the facade of their perfect marriage. Caspian grew restless and resentful, feeling trapped in Pine Haven. Madison, devoted to her work in her hometown, couldn't understand his discontent. The couple's once vibrant conversations devolved into tense silences and bitter arguments. Little did Madison know that this first taste of marital discord was merely a prelude to the turmoil that lay ahead. The unraveling of Madison and Caspian's marriage was a slow, painful process that played out over the course of 2 years. Caspian's frustration with small-town life and his unfulfilled ambitions led him to become increasingly withdrawn and irritable. He began spending more time at the local bar, drowning his sorrows and lamenting his unrealized dreams to anyone who would listen. Madison, for her part, threw herself into her work at the library, organizing reading programs for children and spearheading a digital archiving project for the town's historical documents. She clung to the hope that if she could just make their life in Pine Haven perfect enough, Caspian would rediscover his love for her and their shared life. The breaking point came in the spring of 2013, when Caspian announced that he had accepted a junior reporter position at a small newspaper in Seattle. He delivered this news not with excitement, but with a sense of grim finality. "We're done here," he said. "I can't do this anymore. I'm suffocating in this town, and I won't let it kill my dreams." Madison was devastated. She pleaded with Caspian to reconsider, to give their marriage another chance, but his mind was made up. Within a week, he had packed his belongings and left Pine Haven, leaving Madison alone in the house they had once hoped to fill with children and laughter. The divorce proceedings were mercifully quick, but the emotional toll on Madison was immense. She retreated into herself, finding solace in her books and her work. The once vivacious woman became a shadow of her former self. Her smile was now tinged with sadness, her eyes carrying the weight of her heartbreak. For 2 years, Madison lived in a state of emotional limbo, going through the motions of her daily life while nursing the wounds of her failed marriage. Little did she know that fate was about to deal her another hand, one that would lead her down a path she could never have imagined. It was on a rain-soaked Tuesday in April 2015 that Silas Q first walked into the Pine Haven Public Library. With his tall frame, Silas cut an impressive figure. He approached Madison's desk with a warm smile, introducing himself as the new high school English teacher. Silas had recently moved to Pine Haven from Portland, seeking a change of pace after the end of his own long-term relationship. As he and Madison began to discuss their shared love of literature, a spark of connection ignited between them. For the first time in years, Madison felt the flutter of excitement in her chest. Over the following weeks, Silas became a regular at the library, often staying until closing time to chat with Madison. Their conversations ranged from passionate debates about the merits of various authors to quiet confidences about their past relationships and hopes for the future. Silas's gentle humor and obvious admiration began to chip away at the walls Madison had built around her heart. The whirlwind romance that followed was the talk of the town. Madison bloomed under Silas's attention, regaining the vibrancy that had dimmed during her years with Caspian. Silas, for his part, seemed utterly devoted to Madison, showering her with affection and romantic gestures. Just 6 months after their first meeting, Silas proposed on the very same spot in the park where they had their first date. Madison, caught up in the intoxicating rush of new love, accepted without hesitation. The couple married in a small, intimate ceremony at the Pine Haven Botanical Gardens, with Madison's parents and a handful of close friends in attendance. As Madison and Silas exchanged vows, promising to love and cherish each other for better or worse, neither could have foreseen the storms that lay ahead. For Madison, it seemed that life had given her a second chance at happiness. But fate, as she would learn, had other plans. The first 2 years of Madison and Silas's marriage seemed to be plucked from the pages of a romance novel. They settled into a charming home on Maple Street, just a short walk from both the library and the high school. Weekends were filled with antiquing trips to neighboring towns, cozy evenings spent reading aloud to each other, and dinner parties with their growing circle of friends. Silas quickly became a beloved figure at Pine Haven High School, his innovative teaching methods and genuine interest in his students earning him the admiration of both pupils and parents alike. Madison beamed with pride whenever she heard people praising her husband's dedication and charm. At home, Silas was attentive and affectionate. He surprised Madison with breakfast in bed on Sunday mornings, left little love notes in her lunch bag, and never failed to ask about her day. To the outside world, they appeared to be the perfect couple, a shining example of mature, devoted love. Yet, as the initial glow of their honeymoon phase began to fade, subtle signs of discord started to emerge. Silas began to work later hours, citing the need to prepare for his classes and grade papers. While Madison initially accepted this as part of his commitment to his job, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of loneliness on the nights when she ate dinner alone. There were other small changes too. Silas became more protective of his phone, often taking calls in another room or quickly putting it away when Madison entered. He started going to the gym more frequently, paying increased attention to his appearance. When Madison commented on these changes, Silas brushed off her concerns with a laugh and a kiss. Despite these niggling doubts, Madison was determined to believe in the strength of their relationship. She threw herself into being the perfect wife, planning elaborate date nights and surprising Silas with thoughtful gifts. If she sometimes felt that his responses to her efforts were a bit forced, she pushed those thoughts aside, chalking it up to the natural ebb and flow of married life. As their third wedding anniversary approached, Madison began to plan a special surprise for Silas, a romantic weekend getaway to the Oregon coast. Little did she know that this trip would set in motion a chain of events that would shatter her world and push her to the very limits of her sanity. It was at the start of the new school year, just a few weeks before their planned anniversary trip, that Lachlan Frost entered their lives. Lachlan, a new biology teacher at Pine Haven High, had arrived from Australia with an easy smile and a laid-back charm that immediately endeared him to both students and faculty. Lachlan stood out in the small town like an exotic bird among sparrows. His Australian accent and penchant for colorful storytelling made him an instant hit in the teacher lounge. Silas and Lachlan hit it off immediately, bonding over their shared love of literature and their experiences as relative newcomers to Pine Haven. They began having lunch together regularly, and soon Silas was inviting Lachlan over for dinner or drinks after school. At first, Madison was pleased to see her husband forming a close friendship. Silas had always been more introverted, and she hoped that Lachlan's outgoing nature might help bring him out of his shell. She enjoyed the lively conversations that filled their home when Lachlan visited, and the way Silas seemed more animated in his presence. However, as the weeks passed, Madison began to notice a shift in the dynamics. Silas and Lachlan seemed to share inside jokes that she wasn't privy to. More concerning were the frequent text messages and phone calls between the two men. Silas's phone would buzz constantly with notifications, and he would often step out of the room to take calls from Lachlan, his voice low and intimate. When Madison casually mentioned these observations to Silas, he dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Lachlan's just going through a tough time adjusting to life here," he explained. "He needs a friend, that's all." Madison tried to quell the unease growing in the pit of her stomach. She told herself she was being paranoid, that she was projecting her past hurts onto her current relationship. But as Silas and Lachlan's friendship continued to deepen, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. As autumn leaves began to fall and a chill crept into the air, Madison's suspicions grew like shadows at dusk. The late nights at the office became more frequent, with Silas often not returning home until well after midnight. When she asked about these late hours, his explanations became increasingly vague and defensive. One evening, as Silas slept, Madison's curiosity got the better of her. With trembling hands, she picked up his phone from the nightstand. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. As she scrolled through his messages, her heart sank. The exchanges between Silas and Lachlan were filled with flirtatious banter and thinly veiled innuendos. There were references to secret meetings and passionate encounters that made Madison's cheeks burn with a mixture of embarrassment and rage. Confronted with this evidence the next morning, Silas vehemently denied any wrongdoing. "It's just how mates talk in Australia," he insisted. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew with each passing day. Madison began to pay closer attention to the way Silas and Lachlan interacted when they were together. She noticed the lingering touches, the meaningful glances, the way their bodies seemed to gravitate towards each other in a room. Little did anyone know, behind Madison's increasingly stoic exterior, a plan was forming, one that would lead to a night of irreversible consequences. On a chilly Friday evening in late November, Madison made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Silas had told her he would be working late again, collaborating with Lachlan on their mysterious project. But something in his voice, a slight tremor of anticipation perhaps, set off alarm bells in Madison's mind. After pacing the house for hours, her suspicions gnawing at her like a hungry beast, Madison grabbed her car keys and drove to the high school. The parking lot was empty, save for two vehicles, Silas's sleek black sedan and Lachlan's rugged SUV. With her heart pounding, Madison made her way to Silas's classroom. As she approached, she heard muffled voices, what sounded like laughter. Steeling herself, she peered through the small window in the door. The scene that greeted her eyes would be forever seared into her memory. Silas and Lachlan were locked in a passionate embrace, their lips meeting in a kiss that left no doubt about the true nature of their relationship. Madison watched, frozen in shock, as her husband's hands roamed Lachlan's body with a familiarity that spoke of long-standing intimacy. For several agonizing minutes, Madison stood there, unable to look away from the tableau of betrayal. She watched as Silas and Lachlan broke apart, their faces flushed and eyes bright with desire. She heard snippets of their conversation, words of love and promises of a future together, that cut her to the core. Finally, as the reality of the situation crashed over her like a tidal wave, Madison stumbled back from the door. She made her way out of the school on unsteady legs, her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. The drive home passed in a blur, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands. Back at the house, Madison moved as if in a trance. She poured herself a large glass of red wine, draining it in quick, desperate gulps before pouring another. As the alcohol coursed through her system, the initial shock began to give way to a burning rage. As the night wore on, Madison's anger and pain continued to build. She thought about confronting Silas when he returned home, but the idea of facing him, of hearing his excuses and lies, was more than she could bear. Instead, she began to formulate a plan, a way to make Silas and Lachlan pay for the pain they had caused her. Little did Madison know, her actions in the coming hours would not only destroy the lives of Silas and Lachlan, but would also set her on a path from which there would be no return. In the days following her discovery, Madison moved through her life like a ghost, going through the motions of her daily routine while her mind churned with a toxic mix of grief, rage, and betrayal. She maintained a facade of normalcy, smiling brittle smiles at patrons in the library and exchanging pleasantries with neighbors, all while a storm brewed within. Silas, oblivious to the fact that his secret had been uncovered, continued his charade of the devoted husband. His attempts at affection now made Madison's skin crawl. Each kiss and caress felt like a fresh betrayal. She found herself studying him when he thought she wasn't looking, searching for signs of the stranger he had become. At night, Madison lay awake, replaying the scenes she had witnessed in the classroom over and over in her mind. She imagined confronting Silas, fantasized about exposing his infidelity to the entire town. But something held her back, a combination of shame, fear, and a deep-seated desire for revenge that was slowly taking root in her heart. As the weekend approached, Madison made a decision. She would confront Silas and Lachlan, force them to face the consequences of their actions. What she didn't realize was that this confrontation would spiral out of control in ways she could never have anticipated. Saturday, December 7th, dawned cold and gray, a fitting backdrop for the tragedy that was about to unfold. Madison woke early, her head pounding from the previous night's excesses, her heart heavy with the weight of her planned confrontation. As evening approached, Madison put her plan into motion. She told Silas she was going to visit her parents for dinner, knowing full well that he would seize the opportunity to invite Lachlan over. With a kiss on the cheek that felt like acid on her skin, she left the house, driving aimlessly around town for hours as she steeled herself for what was to come. At 9:30 p.m., Madison parked her car a block away from the house and approached on foot. Through the living room window, she could see Silas and Lachlan on the couch, their bodies close, heads bent in intimate conversation. The sight sent a fresh wave of pain and anger coursing through her. Taking a deep breath, Madison entered the house quietly. She could hear Silas and Lachlan's voices drifting from the living room, punctuated by soft laughter. With trembling hands, she reached into her purse and pulled out the small handgun she had taken from her father's collection earlier that week. As she stepped into the living room, time seemed to slow down. Silas and Lachlan looked up, their expressions shifting from surprise to fear as they registered the gun in Madison's hand. Silas stood up slowly, his hands raised in a pleading gesture. Madison was beyond talking. Months of pain, betrayal, and pent-up rage exploded out of her in a torrent of accusations and obscenities. She screamed at them, demanding to know how long they had been lying to her, how they could have betrayed her so callously. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but to Madison, it felt like an eternity. As Silas took a step towards her, perhaps intending to disarm her, Madison's finger tightened on the trigger. The first shot caught Silas in the chest, the impact throwing him backward onto the couch. Before she could fully register what she had done, Madison turned the gun on Lachlan, firing twice in rapid succession. The room fell silent, save for the ringing in Madison's ears and the ragged sound of her own breathing. Silas lay motionless on the couch, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Lachlan was slumped on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing. As the reality of what she had done began to sink in, Madison dropped the gun. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she sank to the floor, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. In a matter of moments, she had destroyed not only the lives of Silas and Lachlan, but her own as well. Outside, a neighbor who had heard the gunshots was already calling 911, setting in motion the final act of this tragic story. The wail of sirens pierced the night air as police cars and ambulances converged on the residence. Neighbors, in pajamas and robes, gathered on the street watching in shock as the drama unfolded before them. Madison offered no resistance as the police entered the house, finding her still sitting on the floor of the living room, her vacant gaze fixed on the lifeless bodies of Silas and Lachlan. She was handcuffed and led to a waiting police car, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. As word of the shooting spread through Pinhaven, the town was plunged into a state of collective shock and grief. The community that had once viewed Madison and Silas as the perfect couple now grappled with the violent reality that had shattered that illusion. The investigation into the double homicide was swift and thorough. Forensic teams combed through the home, collecting evidence that would later be presented at trial. Madison's fingerprints on the gun, gunshot residue on her hands, and the testimony of neighbors who had heard the shots left little doubt about her guilt in the physical act of the killings. However, as the case progressed, a more complex picture began to emerge. Interviews with Madison's friends and family painted a portrait of a woman who had been deeply wronged and pushed to her breaking point. The defense team, led by prominent criminal attorney Veronica Sloan, began to build a case around temporary insanity and extreme emotional distress. Prosecution witnesses included forensic experts who detailed the ballistics evidence and the brutality of the killings. But it was the testimony of those who knew the parties involved that proved most compelling. Former colleagues of Silas and Lachlan spoke of the obvious chemistry between the two men and of Madison's increasing isolation in the months leading up to the shooting. The defense called a series of expert witnesses, including psychologists, who testified to Madison's fragile mental state and the extreme emotional trauma caused by discovering her husband's affair. Madison's own testimony was a pivotal moment in the trial. In a voice barely above a whisper, she recounted the night she discovered Silas and Lachlan together and the overwhelming emotions that had driven her to violence. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. In a packed courtroom, with tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, the foreman stood to deliver their decision on the charge of first-degree murder for the death of Silas. The jury found Madison guilty of the lesser charge of second-degree murder for the death of Lachlan Frost. They again returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of second-degree murder for Silas. At the sentencing hearing 2 weeks later, Judge Blackwell had the unenviable task of determining Madison's fate. After hearing impassioned pleas from both the prosecution and defense, as well as impact statements from the families of Silas and Lachlan, the judge rendered her decision. Taking into account the circumstances of the crime and Madison's lack of prior criminal history, Judge Blackwell sentenced her to 20 years to life for each count, to be served concurrently. Madison would be eligible for parole after serving a minimum of 20 years. As Madison was led from the courtroom, the tragic saga that had gripped Pinhaven and the nation for months finally came to a close.